We lay, my love and I, beneath the weeping willow. But now alone I lie, and weep beside the tree, singing, O willow waly, by the tree that weeps with me, singing, O willow waly, till my lover return to me. Surprise and welcome everyone to a special episode of the Wacko Prophet podcast. My name is Imran. If you're a returning viewer, hello. I hope you're pleasantly surprised. And if you're new, welcome. Here at the Wacko Prophet podcast, you get to listen to my amateur but in-depth review of movies, TV and web series, books and games. I'm a 30-year-old man from Sri Lanka who has been watching movies and series, reading books and gaming in some form or another for most of my life. And I tend to be highly opinionated about all these things. I also tend to be very picky and specific about what I watch. Right now, I'm in the middle of reviewing every single episode of the YouTube Red and Netflix series Cobra Kai Season 1. If this particular episode comes out on time, I would have finished 7 episodes of Cobra Kai with 3 more left to be completed. But this simply could not wait. As the title indicates, this is an additional episode where I will be giving my impressions and thoughts on the recently released Netflix series, The Haunting of Bly Manor. I won't be reviewing the series episode by episode, but I'll be doing one big podcast episode, which is what you're listening to right now, to talk about the entire season. Now, to start off, I'll talk about the series and those involved in it without going into story spoilers. I'll give you a little warning and then go right into talking about different themes and philosophies that I think the show expressed very well, which, naturally, would mean that I'll be going into major spoilers just by association. The Haunting of Bly Manor is essentially Season 2 of the Haunting series on Netflix, created by one Mike Flanagan. I say essentially Season 2 because there is no story connection as far as I can see between this and Season 1. They are anthologies, meaning each season tells a different, unrelated story, usually in the same or similar genre. Think True Detective or American Horror Story. The first season of this anthology was The Haunting of Hill House. From now on, I'll be referring to them as Hill House and Bly Manor. If you're listening to this podcast and got this far, and you haven't watched Hill House or Bly Manor, I would strongly suggest that you watch Hill House first, and then get to Bly Manor. Somehow, I find that gives me an appreciation of both stories in a way that I may not have had if I had watched Bly Manor first. Bly Manor was released worldwide on the Netflix streaming platform on the 9th of October 2020, just in time for Halloween season, and smack dab in the middle of a global pandemic, which has caused most people to stay indoors more than ever. I finished watching Bly Manor over 2 days, on the 9th and the 10th of October, because I've been anticipating it since its announcement last year, and I was keenly interested in Flanagan's work ever since I watched Hill House. If you're into horror at all, you may be familiar with some of his work. Other than the Haunting Anthology series, he has directed a string of horror and thriller movies. To name a few, there's Absentia, 2011, 2013's Oculus, Hush in 2016, Ouija, Origin of Evil in 2016, Gerald's Game in 2017, which is a Stephen King book, and most recently, Dr. Sleep in 2019, starring none other than General Kenobi himself, Ewan McGregor, and which is once again a Stephen King novel and a sequel to his masterpiece, The Shining. If you watched any of the movies mentioned above, you'll know that Flanagan is quite good at what I call conventional horror, with all the jump scares and musical crescendos and creepy dialogue, but also he's pretty adept at making his audience feel the more subtle, nuanced dread as well. He applies the same skill set to his Haunting anthology. Now, as of this recording, Hill House is actually rated higher than Bly Manor in sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb, which is hopefully and most likely due to the time difference, but may also speak to an idea that I've been hearing a lot from my friend circle and also from my social media feed. The idea that Bly Manor is not as scary or is not as good as Hill House. These are obviously opinions and are by their nature subjective, just like mine are, so I can't fault them. However, if you are a fan of Hill House and you have been hearing this sentiment of Bly Manor being not as good, let me talk about that a bit right now. Firstly, I get it. You're a fan of Hill House. You enjoyed it a lot and you loved the scares and the twists. You're looking forward for more. Your expectations are completely rational. Having said that, I'll tell you now, Bly Manor is not a sequel to Hill House in terms of tone and scares. It is creepy and foreboding and tragic in its own beautiful way, but it is nothing like Hill House. It is much slower and deliberate than the former, and this is intentional. I would say a direct comparison might feel fair to you because you're automatically connecting Bly Manor to Hill House, but it would be an unfair comparison simply because of the fact that Bly Manor is not even trying to be as scary as Hill House. It is trying to be something else, and more often than not, it achieves this to perfection. Because of this, because Bly Manor excels at what it is, it would be unfair for the story and the characters to compare it to those in Hill House. I would suggest going into Bly Manor with no expectations. Have a bit of faith that Flanagan knows what he's doing because he does, and jump in. If possible, binge it, because the story comes together very slowly and deliberately, but some episodes may leave you a bit scatterbrained if you don't finish it in one go. Try not to look for and prepare yourself for scares, because the scares and dread that are there usually play out in a different way than in Hill House. Finally, once you're done with the entire thing, I would suggest sitting on it for a bit. Let the story brew in you. When I finished Bly Manor, I thought that I liked it as much as I liked Hill House. But the more I sat and thought about it, the more I found myself thinking about specific things in the story while I was working or commuting. I found myself realizing that I enjoyed Bly Manor a lot more. Hill House was excellent at what it was. Bly Manor is better at what it is. It may not be your cup of tea, but it certainly was mine. Okay, this is the point where I'd say you'd best watch Hill House and Bly Manor and come back to me before continuing, because I'll be discussing specific points that may spoil some aspects of the story. I like to go into these kind of stories completely blind, so I'll give you the same courtesy. It's alright. I can wait. Okay, are you back? You're done watching the whole thing? You sure? Good, let's get into it. For those of you who've tuned in before, you know how my podcasts go. I don't talk about the show beat by beat. I talk about specific things I liked, the good, and specific things I disliked, the bad. The good, the bad I talk about at length, going into different things I noticed and appreciated and disapproved of. Afterwards, I highlight some important stuff that may not have had enough meat to be discussed in the good, but deserves a mention nonetheless. Everyone I know who enjoyed Bly Manor had an absolute shit ton of things they'd like to say about it, and I happen to be one of those people. But I will try to stick to the structure I mentioned previously, because this podcast has to end, and I could talk for literal hours about this show if not. So obviously, I may miss some things that you noticed or that you think deserves a mention. If I did, please feel free to drop me a message in any of my social media. You can find links on the podcast description. Okay, let's get into it. Obviously, you've been listening to me gush over the show all this time, so there'll be more good than bad. Let's get started. The good, number 1. The performances of the 2 child actors. I've heard it put this way. In Hill House, the children are the ones being scared and terrorized. In Bly Manor, the children are the ones doing the scaring and the terrorizing. I've also heard the 2 child actors in the show be referred to as the creepy kids. While this is not entirely untrue, I feel like it oversimplifies some solid, incredible performances by both child actors. Emily B. Smith and Benjamin Evan Ainsworth play Flora and Miles Wingrave respectively. They are two strange orphaned children and the niece and nephew of Lord Henry Wingrave, played by Henry Thomas. The reason I said that calling them creepy or freaky is an oversimplification is because both characters are so much more than that. This is not a situation like The Ring or The Orphan, where the child or the would-be child character is downright freaky and disturbing the entire way, for the entire duration of the show. What makes these performances special are the two child actors' ability to switch between being polite and, in Emily's case, ridiculously sweet little children to being creepy in a heartbeat. I say in a heartbeat because that's how it's shot in the series, in the finished product that we saw. I'm not sure how Flanagan managed to get these performances out of these actors that are so young, but they do it regardless, and it's amazing to watch. Flora specializes in just freaking you out in the most unexpected times, like when Danny knocked over a doll after putting Flora to bed, only to find Flora sitting bolt upright in bed and speaking to Danny in a deadpan voice. It helps that she has a sweet little voice and a British accent, because she turns towards that freaky, dark side seemingly on a dime. Miles just turns into a creep, and I have to compliment his ability of Flanagan's direction and also the writing, because what Miles says and how Miles says it when he is in creep mode just makes your skin crawl. He is like the dude who doesn't understand personal space and is always looking for a chance to say or do something inappropriate to a woman. Of course, we find out later that he is being possessed by Peter Quint, and it makes perfect sense. Because as charming as he is, Peter fucking Quint is a creep, and the young actor who plays Miles channels that creep factor down to a T. So much so that Victoria Pedretti, who plays Danny Clayton, the protagonist, looks visibly uncomfortable when acting alongside the little kid, especially when he's being a creep. It was amazing. As much as I will go on to compliment the rest of the cast because they're all great, let it be known that this whole thing would not have worked as well as it did had the kids not excelled at what they did. It's also obvious that Flanagan had the actors palling out together both on and off set. I don't know much about how filmmaking works, but I'd imagine it would be easier for characters to get along on screen when they know and like each other off screen, specifically when it comes to child actors. I had no problem believing that Flora and Miles knew and loved everyone in Bly Manor, from Owen Sharma the cook, Hannah Gross the housekeeper, to Jamie the groundskeeper and gardener. Flanagan clearly knows how to manage and cultivate a good environment for acting. The characters of Flora and Miles were also written very believably. They were not just dumb child characters only there to garner sympathy. 2 episodes down the line, I genuinely gave a shit for Flora and Miles while also being cautious about their strangeness. There was also some subtle believability in their behavior when they were not being creepy. We find out by episode 3 that Flora picked up her little perfectly splendid from Rebecca Jessel, the ill-fated first au pair. Miles clearly looks up to Peter and listens to him, wanting to be more like him even before the dead Peter started literally possessing him. And also both of them, both Miles and Flora, are constantly asking for their uncle. These kids who have lost their parents in a way that they don't quite understand, as Peter so aptly said it in episode 3, are now picking up words and mannerisms from the adults that they have left. They're looking for a role model, having lost their mom and dad at a very young age. Even in the last episode, I like that small scene where Henry is helping them get dressed up. Both Flora and Miles are desperate to know more about their parents. As tragic as the ending of Bly Manor was, I'm happy that the two kids got someone to lean on, and Henry managed to step up and be that rock in Flora and Miles' world. The good number 2. How fleshed out the characters and their motivations are. Bly Manor does something that I haven't seen a show or a series truly achieve in a very long time. It manages to make us give a shit about almost every character in the show, even the more unsavory ones. The writers do a stellar job balancing the audience's need for answers, or at least my need for answers, while also understanding that you don't necessarily need to explain every single thing in excruciating detail. For the most part, Bly Manor is excellent at giving the right scene and the right reveal at the right time, so that we understand why a particular character is doing a specific thing. Even if we don't understand something someone is doing when we are watching them do it, Bly Manor makes sure to give context in a late episode while also respecting the audience's intelligence and not explicitly saying that this happened because of this. Look. The best example for this really is the villain of the story, or the only human villain, I suppose, Peter Quint. He's played wonderfully by Oliver Jackson Cohen, who played, if you remember, Luke in Hill House. Peter Quint, and let me make this abundantly clear, is an absolute dick. He is, to quote one of the characters in the series, a bit of a shit. This is made apparent from the first episode he has a speaking role in, episode 3. But they hint at it before this as well. The character design and the way he dresses, his hair, the pointed face, the smirk, it all shows him being a douche. He's a Malfoy, if I ever saw one. Maybe not in wealth or status, but certainly in attitude. He gives off this vibe of being an entitled prick. Even his line delivery is usually very condescending. If all these signals are lost on the oblivious viewer, the breaking point is surely the conversation he has with little Miles Wingrave in episode 3. Peter's little description of how he sees people as being locked rooms and how you can access them simply by finding the right key is a pretty despicable way of looking at things, and indeed, people. Peter sees everyone that is not him as objects, as things to be unlocked or broken into for your convenience or your own needs. Flanagan doesn't give us the opportunity there to feel any sympathy towards Peter, because Peter uses this analogy to describe Rebecca Jessel in particular, the woman that we know that he claimed to love. The whole thing is made more disconcerting and distasteful by the fact that he tells this to a young, impressionable kid who very clearly looks up to him. This behavior and worldview of Peter's is implied to be almost pathological. He can only see others as things, nothing more and nothing less. Now, this is shown very well in episode 3. If you remember episode 3, that is the episode where they switch continuously back and forth between Rebecca Jessel's and Peter Quint's story, while also showing the present. In the present, Flora and Miles couldn't sleep, and Owen and Jamie stays over for the second night, and the children put on what they call story time. Flora pretends to be a cat or a kitten, and Miles pretends to be a puppet named Poppet. Except that, in Miles' performance, halfway through his recital, he veers off into a story about how a puppet master, upon returning home, finds out that all his puppets are laughing at him, and he hurts them to remind them that he is in control. Flanagan doesn't bother clarifying that little creepy bit of theatre beyond that scene, but that was clearly Peter, literally talking through Miles. Peter sees himself as the puppet master, and everyone else as his puppets. It's also clear that that's how he sees others as well, meaning he thinks that everyone else is just doing things for others, good things to others, in order to find their key, just like he does. Which is why he got so unreasonably jealous at the innocently charming Owen getting Rebecca to taste his cake batter. Peter sees that as Owen moving in on his property, because that's what he sees Rebecca as. The whole of episode 3 is a character certificate of Peter Quint, if nothing else. And surprise, surprise, we find out in a late episode that Peter had been similarly manipulated by his parents almost his entire life. He sees people as possessions, things to be owned and used, because he had been treated as one from a younger age. That little bit of information humanizes him, no doubt, but does not bring him over to the territory of a victim. He is still very much the villain, the human villain at least, of the story. I'd like to talk in detail about every single character of Bly Manor, but I will be talking for hours. All I can say is that Flanagan and the writers consistently gave a good amount of their time fleshing out characters and their motivations, and they do it well, because everything everyone did in the story was pretty much within character from beginning to end. If you want to really analyze it or overanalyze it as I have done, I do recommend that you rewatch the series again, because it has very high replay value or rewatch value. Okay, moving on. The good number 3, the multiple different love stories. Like I said in the beginning of this podcast episode, Bly Manor is not a horror. It's not a conventional horror, at least. I would say that it is a tragedy and a love story masquerading as a horror. The adult Flora in episode 9 was vocalizing what we were all thinking at that point, that the storyteller had mischaracterized her tale as a ghost story, when it was in fact a love story. As I mentioned in previous podcast episodes, I generally find it difficult to watch fictionalized love stories because of how unrealistic or how overdone or how juvenile they can be. Most modern love stories are like that. Having said that, Bly Manor contains multiple love stories that are all done extremely well, and I'll talk about them bit by bit right now. First, we have the love story of Peter and Rebecca. Possessive love, or the wrong kind of love, as Jamie so aptly said. Peter saw Rebecca and was impressed by her academic qualifications and her intelligence and was obsessed with her beauty. His way of expressing those feelings were very much on brand. Peter simply treated her as a possession to be charmed and manipulated into his belonging. As I mentioned earlier, he does not like when he is charmed by other men, wants her to do exactly what he tells her to do, and is selfish to the point of tricking her into dying, killing herself, but cowardly enough that he doesn't stick around to actually experience the sensation of drowning. Very contradictingly, he seems to want an independent, strong-willed woman who, conversely, bends completely to his will and his will alone. I can personally say that, yeah, I've seen this kind of love. In real life, I mean. The kind where the man or the woman assumes control almost entirely of the other person's life, dictating what they can do and cannot do, and who they can or cannot associate with. It's the wrong kind of love, but it is there. Number 2, the love story of Hannah and Owen. I'd call this unfulfilled love. As much as hugging and hand-holding and kissing is part of a good fictionalized love story, I'm very happy to watch a love story that is told without feeling the necessity to shove those things in where they don't belong. As much as I felt upset and distraught at Danny and Jamie's love story, I'd say Owen's and Hannah's is the most tragic of all the stories in Bly. The worst of it all being Hannah was finally ready to acknowledge her feelings towards Owen and actually go to Paris with him. And yet it was too late for her because she was already dead at that point, but just didn't know it. As I hear myself say that sentence, I know how ridiculous and cheesy that sounds. So props to the amazing Tanaya Miller, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Tanaya Miller, and of course the amazing Rahul Kohli, who really sell the, oh, we're not so secretly in love with each other, effortlessly. Number 3, the love story or the love triangle of Henry, Charlotte, and Dominic Wingrave. Forbidden love. This is straight up infidelity, there's no two words about it, but motivated on all sides, it appears, by love. Bly Manor does something that I quite like here, where they don't give us too much information. So Flanagan doesn't waste our time explaining how Henry fell in love with Charlotte, what their discussions were, how did Flora come about, or anything. We are simply given the information that Charlotte appears to be conflicted between Dominic, her husband, and Henry, her brother-in-law. Both men love her, and Flora is in fact Henry's daughter. We're also shown how good a man Dominic is, as he chooses to treat Flora as his own daughter and love her no differently than he would have his own biological child after he finds out about his wife's infidelity. A lesser show would have used that little piece of information to squeeze out more drama, but Bly Manor insists on being an exception. This is in fact a massive contributor to Henry's guilt, other than the fact that the affair itself brought about Dominic and Charlotte's doomed trip abroad. Dominic's proclamation to love Flora as his own keeps Henry from loving her after Dominic's death, because he feels that he is further insulting the memory of his brother by going there. Number 4, Owen and Margaret Sharma. Parental love. Now, when I talk about parental love, I can obviously talk about how the Wingraves loved their children, but I think it's portrayed better in the relationship between Owen and his mother. Now, we don't see Margaret Sharma at all in any of the 9 episodes of Bly Manor. We know that she suffers from dementia, is looked after by Owen, and dies at the end of episode 3, with her funeral taking place off-screen in episode 4. But we know so much about her through how Owen speaks about her in that one incredible bonfire scene in episode 4. That episode reminds me that, yeah, Parental love, in this case a love of a son for his mother, is enough to make a mark on the audience who haven't even seen Margaret Sharma. Props to Rahul Kohli once again for amazing delivery of that little speech. We all loved and missed our mothers at that point. And number 5, finally, of course, Danny and Jamie's love story. For someone who does not usually enjoy love stories, this one broke me. A lot of my friends who have finished Bly Manor agree that this is one of the most enjoyable, natural love stories that they've watched in fiction in a long time. Obviously, horror is not usually the place you'd expect to find a good love story, and I can say that I'm very pleasantly surprised that I found one here. I'll try not to gush over it too much, but suffice it to say that I was fully invested in their story and was really hoping that they get a happy ending. And they sort of did. It was not a permanent happy ending, but as the storyteller and older Jamie correctly said, they got years and years together, which is more than what most people get. Their love is the polar opposite of Peter and Rebecca's. It's all about giving and not taking. Like Danny said again, I believe in episode 3, ownership and love are opposites. And Peter's love story with Rebecca is the example of ownership, possessive love. And Danny and Jamie's love story is the opposite, sacrificial love, actual love. I'm not ashamed at all to say that I was bawling my head off by the end of the series when Jamie drags a chair to face the door, cracks the door open a bit, and falls asleep on the chair. The song that plays at that moment, Sheryl Crow's I Shall Believe, did not help at all. What I felt when I saw the love story's conclusion is not sadness really, but melancholy. I felt happy that Danny and Jamie had so much time together, but upset that it could not be more. The good number 4. The different types of hauntings. Now, 2 of the hauntings shown in Bly Manor, the series, are not supernatural hauntings at all, but are the ones that I possibly enjoyed the most. Let me talk about both of them separately. Firstly, I'm talking, of course, about Danny's haunting by her fiancé, Edmund, seen for the most part like the Elijah Wood character from Sin City. He's a psychological manifestation of her guilt, essentially. We find out that he died on the same day, within a few hours almost, of finding out that Danny doesn't want to marry him, and possibly finding out why as well. I appreciate and sympathize with the fear that Danny has, because after Edmund's death, I doubt Danny got around to telling his parents that she had called off the marriage. She didn't seem too comfortable discussing her sexuality even before that event. The guilt and the shade that manifested from it is what pushes Danny to run away to England and run away from her own reflection, literally. She was jittery to begin with, but the incident made her anxiety even worse. I quite like the way Pedretti plays Danny. She played a similar character, Nellie, in Hill House, but where Nellie appeared entirely unstable and vulnerable, Danny exhibits bravery and guts while also fighting her inner demons. She decides to confront and overcome her demons in episode 4 after her first intimate interaction with Jamie, and Jamie's little speech in episode 6 in front of the moonflowers really helps putting away that guilt, or perhaps helps Danny cope with it in a healthier way. The second psychological haunting, of course, is Henry's alter ego. This is a bit off-putting in execution, but I understand and appreciated the need for it as well. Again, this has nothing to do with Bly Manor's hauntings. It doesn't even manifest in Bly, but it does in Henry's office, just after he gets the phone call about Dominic and Charlotte's deaths. His alter ego is also what Dominic described Henry to be in their final confrontation, before Dominic leaves the office premises for good. Henry Thomas plays the alter ego with delicious, cartoonish glee and with a horrible smile. You get the feeling that he is enjoying it a lot. The actor, that is enjoying it a lot. The scenes with the alter ego also have some cool camera work and special effects, it looks like, because Henry Wingrave and the alter ego seamlessly share the screen, and the alter ego just turns up in multiple places in one shot of the camera following Henry. It's done beautifully. I'd really love to see the behind the scenes of that particular scene. The good number 5. the incredible scenes allowing actors to flex their acting muscles. Now, I'm not going to linger too much on this, but suffice it to say that several actors get some amazing scenes to shine and really show off their monologuing skills. I already mentioned Rahul Kohli in the bonfire scene. We have a similar but much longer scene of Jamie detailing her childhood to Danny in episode 6 that really gives Amelia Eve a lot of leeway to just go all in with the feels. That scene is bordering on being corny, but does the job extremely well. It just lays out Jamie's vulnerabilities in the open for Danny to see. It does double duty of showing Danny how Jamie had chosen to trust her and hopes to connect with her in a deeper level, while also moving the story of their relationship forward in a very natural way. And it's on brand for the character of Jamie, who is as no-nonsense as they come, to want to get right into the subject without dancing around it. My compliments to Amelia Eve for her delivery, Pedretti for just her reactions which added to the emotion of the entire scene, and of course to Flanagan and the writers of the show. We also have an episode-wide show of fantastic acting by Tanaya Miller in episode 5, I believe called The Altar of the Dead, which takes place almost entirely within her mind and within Hannah's mind and within Hannah's memories. This is another clever trick by Flanagan that does multiple things at once. We get a truncated version of Hannah's story where we find out about her husband or partner's infidelity and why she chose to call Bly Manor her home. We find out exactly how she feels about Owen and her desire to actually go with him to Paris. We see how she first met Owen, or at least how she remembers it, because let me remind you, we're seeing a memory, not the real thing. We also see that her conscience, her moral sense of right and wrong, is represented in her mind by Owen. Her mind conjures up an Owen as she first met him, to tell her what is wrong and what is right, and to point her in the right direction. If that's not love, then I don't know what is. And finally, the episode serves to show us that Hannah Gross died before she was even introduced to Danny. Her body is at the bottom of the well, but she does not quite know she is dead, kept in the gravity well that is Bly Manor by the spectre that was once Viola. All this craziness could have easily led to being melodramatic and kooky had it not been for Tanaya Miller carrying that whole episode with a great assist from Rahul Kohli. So hats off again from me to the two of them. And that's the good. It is by no means the only good thing about Bly Manor, but are the ones that I appreciated the most. Okay, moving on to the bad. The bad number 1. Episode 8. Now, before you eat me alive, let me tell you that I don't agree with the notion that this episode was unnecessary or that it was filler. Now, if you remember, episode 8 was the episode that showed Viola's descent into being a spectre, the history of Bly Manor, so to speak. My primary complaint here is the timing of when the episode came out. I'm going to guess that although most of them didn't know it, this is the actual complaint that most people had as well, when you boil it all down. I love Katie Siegel and her performance as the tragic Viola. She carries the entire episode and does a splendid job of it. The issue that I have is that when you spend a whole episode giving the origin of the lady in the lake, and when they do it just after Danny is put into a life or death situation, I want to know as soon as possible whether Danny is alright. I suppose you could say that the writers and the creator doomed themselves by making us give a shit about almost all the characters of the series. So much so that I was more than a little impatient to get back to the present and see what happens. But hey, as a counterpoint, I also cannot think of a more suitable place to put Viola's story other than episode 8. If you had put it any earlier, it would not have been as impactful and may not have made sense. If it had been later, we simply would not have cared, given the tear-jerking ending of episode 9. So the question is, should they have included the episode at all? I think that yes, they should have. And I think that they did it in the best way they could. We needed to know why Bly Manor was the way it is, and the episode does more than enough to clear our doubts. The constant repetition of the episode, where she wakes, she walks, she sleeps, while appearing needlessly long when we watch the episode, serves as groundwork when we find out that Danny makes the ultimate sacrifice by the end of the series. It reinforces the courage and strength that Danny had in life and in death to continue to hold back that mindless monster by sheer force of will. So I have no complaints about that whatsoever. It just seems like something that has to happen, a story that has to be told, and was told as best as it could be, with it only being marked as a low point because of the ridiculously high expectations and hopes that viewers had by the time we got to that episode. The bad number 2, the accents. I've heard a lot of complaining about how bad the accents sounded, I suppose. Now, I am, once again, let me repeat myself, from Sri Lanka. So I wouldn't know a good British or Scottish accent from a bad one if it hit me over the head. The accents only actually threw me off when it came to Peter and Henry. Maybe because I knew them so well as Luke and Hugh Crane from Hill House, where they played Americans. Other than that, it really didn't bother me, but I'm bringing it up here because I'm really reaching to find something bad to talk about. And that's it. That's the good and the bad that I've noticed so far of Bly Manor. Now, I'll be rewatching it again, but for now, that's all I have. Now, before I sign off, I'd like to talk about some more important stuff that I did not mention previously, the ones that didn't have enough meat to be talked about separately or in detail. Number 1, the foreshadowing. Bly Manor does a lot of foreshadowing very well. Let me highlight a couple of them for you. Owen calling Bly Manor a gravity well in the very first episode, and it being exactly that because of Viola's spectre. Flora talking to Owen about dying when he comes to Bly Manor for dinner after his mum's funeral. Flora talks about dying and not knowing you're dead. And I quote, "What if I was already dead, but nobody else knew? And I was walking around dead, but everybody could see and hear me." End quote. Just as Flora was saying that bit, the camera shows Hannah Gross, because that's exactly what Hannah Gross is at that moment. Walking around dead and nobody knows it. Not her and not us. Not until episode 5. More foreshadowing. In the same scene, Flora continues saying that she learned the secret and that she doesn't need to be sad. Dead doesn't mean gone. And this little bit of dialogue really makes Owen happy, and it does sound sweet. But let me remind you, she means that literally, because at that point she knows that Peter Quint and Rebecca Jessel and so many others are still in Bly, despite having died. So she literally meant dead doesn't mean gone, because she can see supposedly dead people still hanging around Bly Manor. Okay, one more, just for the road. In episode 3, Miles has a bad dream about having hurt Hannah. He mentions it to her while they're taking the children up to bed. Miles specifically says that he had a dream that he had hurt her and that it made him feel bad. And turns out in episode 5, we find out that in fact, he did. Peter, possessing Miles' body, pushed Hannah down the well in Bly Manor grounds, killing her. Yet another reason that Peter is the villain. And that's just some examples of some foreshadowing that Bly Manor has done quite well. I'll now continue with some other interesting things that I noticed. How did Hannah Gross know that Owen would come back to Bly on the night of his mom's funeral? Flora asks the same question. Well, maybe because she asked him to. If you recall at the end of episode 3, when Owen finds out about his mom's death and gets into the car to leave the manor, Hannah whispers something in his ear. Maybe along with all the I'm sorry for your losses and everything else, maybe she was telling him to come right back and stay with them if he can't cope. I hope they don't answer this, to be honest, because it's fun to speculate, but I'm going to guess that might have been a part of what she said at that point. Another interesting point. There's a little Easter egg connecting Bly Manor to Hill House. In episode 9, when Owen is trying to bring Henry back because Henry was almost killed by the lady in the lake, Henry the ghost has a conversation right in front of Owen with Hannah the ghost. And she says, and I quote, "When he checks the well, please tell Owen I'm sorry. tell him I love him. And the rest, well, it's just, end quote. And then she gets cut off because Henry comes back to life. I believe she was going to say the rest is confetti, almost exactly like a line told by Nellie in Hill House. And I quote, I loved you completely, and you loved me the same. That's all. The rest is confetti, end quote. I don't know if I'm wrong, I'm just kind of reaching here, but had I been correct, that would have been a nice Easter egg put there by Flanagan. And one final little thing that I've noticed now that I've rewatched Bly Manor about 2 or 3 times. Once you have finished Bly Manor, I recommend that you go and watch episode 1 from the beginning. Because so much of what the storyteller does, because by now we know that the storyteller is an older Jamie. So much of what the storyteller does in the opening of the series makes sense now. In fact, the end of the series and the beginning of the series is connected. It's bookended by what Jamie does. If you remember, the series ends with Jamie grabbing a chair, making it face the door, keeping the door open a bit, and then falling asleep, hoping that Danny shows up. And the series opens with Jamie waking up in a chair in pretty much the same position. So that is a little bit more that you'll get only if you rewatch it. Because when you watch Bly Manor for the first time, it doesn't really register what she's doing there. It doesn't really make sense. But by the end, maybe it's been about 9 hours, so you may have forgotten how the series opened. So I do recommend that you rewatch Bly Manor if you're done with it. And that's all I have. That's all I have for this episode of the Wacko Forward podcast. This surprised episode, I should say. So those are my thoughts on Bly Manor. I have really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to future stuff from Mike Flanagan. For example, I am aware that he is currently in the middle of filming something called Midnight Mass, where Rahul Kohli is also involved. I believe it's another horror series for Netflix. So I'm really looking forward to that. We don't know any details about when it'll come out and what it'll be about. But I am sure I'll dive into that series completely blind, like I did for Bly Manor. And I recommend that you do it as well. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Well, thank you very much for joining me and listening me rant about a horror series on Netflix. I do really like getting into this kind of drama and really talking about it, and I appreciate a drama or a series that has the guts to really focus in on good dialogue and good acting more than horror. As much as I like conventional horror, I think I like good drama more. So if you have any complaints or any feedback or anything that you'd like to say to me, please feel free to reach out to me through any of my social media. I've given the links to all my social media on the description of this episode of this podcast. I've also left a link to the YouTube version of this particular episode, and you can leave a comment on my YouTube channel as well, The Wacko Prophet. So there you have it. Next week, what I'll most likely be doing is I have only 3 episodes left to finish Cobra Kai Season 1. I might go at all 3 episodes at once and do one big review for it because it seems like it's the finale. So we'll see how that works out. So I'll keep you posted. Thank you very much for your time and your patience and for listening to my horrible voice. See you the same time next week. Sri Lanka is still in the middle of a pandemic, and so is most of the rest of the world. So I hope everyone is doing well and keeping their social distancing and wearing the masks and doing everything that is required to be done. This has been the Wacko Prophet podcast, and I am the Wacko Prophet, Imran. You have yourself a great evening.